Welcome to part 3, our third and final part of the Knights of the Frozen Throne set review. In this part, I'm going to do things just a little bit differently than I have in the past. I'm going to occasionally group together some cards that have similar effects to talk about them at the same time. And also, I am going to put a little bit more focus on cards that these new neutral cards will work with throughout the rest of the set, as well as from previous sets. So let's dive in. We're going to start things off with the Lich King and his trusty companion Arthas. Both of these cards draw Death Knight cards, and no, these are not random Death Knights. You're not going to be playing these and potentially drawing an Anduin or a Gul'dan or something. Death Knight cards are a separate category of cards, kind of similar to the Ysera cards, which can only be created by these two cards. On average, these cards are very powerful. These are quite a bit better than a normal spell that you're going to be able to put into your deck. Some of them are a bit better than others, but I believe all of them are good enough that drawing one of them is going to be better than drawing a random card on average. So how good is the Lich King? How good is Arthas? With the Lich King, I think this card is just incredible. His downside is that he's an Ironbark protector that draws you the worst of the Death Knight cards, which I believe is Death Grip. The upside is that he draws you multiple cards over multiple turns, and he trades for at least several minions, because an 8-mana 8/8 taunt is really nothing to wag a stick at. So I think this card is just going to see play in pretty much anything that wants to be playing 8 drops. Bigger mid-range decks, most control decks. He's also an excellent card to hit off of Shadow Essence and would definitely be a part of any Shadow Essence deck that may or may not be created. So I'm going to give him a pretty high rating. I think he fits into a lot of decks, and I think he's very powerful. As far as Arthas is concerned, I think that he's just a little bit below rate as a 4-mana 2/2 to be played in the average deck. If you do get 2 triggers off of his Death Rattle, if you can consistently do that with Hunter cards, for instance, I think this card's going to be very good. If you're able to abuse the Death Rattle mechanic to get any sort of benefit, this card is probably going to be worth your while, because these Death Knight cards are quite strong. So I would not expect to see Arthas find a wide play, but I would expect him to be a good card in decks that can get value off of his Death Rattle. Next are our 3 princes, which I think are among the legendaries that people are going to be most disappointed to open. There's just such a large number of exciting legendaries and Death Knights in this set, and these are quite narrow in their applications. Each of them has a battle cry ability that only works if you have no cards remaining in your deck which have the same mana cost as them. Their effects are all quite good if you don't have any cards remaining in your deck at these costs, but that's a very high deck building cost. So if you have to decrease the power of your overall deck just to facilitate one card, I think you're likely not going to be happy with these. Even if they are pretty good, even if they do have a very powerful effect on the game, if you don't draw them, you're going to be drawing cards which on average are going to be worse than if you had just built your deck normally. So where do these cards fit? I think they fit into decks where you do not have to impose very strict deck building restrictions. If your deck naturally does not run any 4s, such as Miracle Rogue, for instance, you might be willing to put this card into your deck because it is above rate. There are also a few decks maybe that might be interested in Prince Keleseth that are very, very heavy on 1-drops and might only run just 2 or 3 2-drops normally. As for Prince Taldaram, he's exactly a faceless manipulator that just costs 2 less. The problem is that 3 is a very, very important cost in most decks, and I think if you're interested in this effect at this discount, you would only be interested in copying your own minions and their own abilities in some kind of combo deck. But I'm not really sure which kind of combo deck wants to do that, because to remove 3s from your deck is likely going to hamper your strategy quite a bit. So I think of the 3, Prince Taldaram is the least likely to see play because the restriction is so heavy. Prince Keleseth could potentially see play in some varieties of aggro decks which are more heavy on 1s and lighter on 2s, and Prince Valinar might just be able to creep his way into decks which just naturally are not heavy on 4s. Rattling Rascal is one of the cards I'm most excited to try out of all of the neutrals because it can just be used in so many different ways. You can try to abuse its Battle Cry trigger by returning it to your hand with cards like Shadow Step and getting value out of it like that. You could try to silence this minion, in which case it would be very above rate. And you could even throw this into evolve decks to try to get quite a bit of a value off of an immediate evolve. I think between all of those different strategies, it will be able to find a home somewhere. I'm just not sure where it's going to be best. I really don't think this card is good enough to see play in just some average mid-range or aggressive deck that doesn't have a way of abusing its mechanics, because it's just so risky to give your opponent a 5/5, and the cost of playing a 4-mana 2/2 when you get a 5/5 and they get a 5/5, which is kind of a wash, I think is just going to be a little bit too high. That said, if you are able to get around the Death Rattle ability or break parity with this card somehow, I do think this card is strong enough to find a home in some decks. Next up, we have a card that I think is going to be bad for a variety of reasons. Its original stats are not bad, but to get value off this card, you need to be discarding cards. And when you discard a weapon, I think you're going to be giving out more damage on average over the course of a long game than if you had just held onto the weapon in the first place, as weapons have durability. I realize that putting the stats onto the minion would enable you to attack with this card over multiple turns, but then you're also just setting yourself up to potentially get blown out by a card like Shadow Word Death or something, which can handle this card in one fell swoop. So I think this is going to be a little bit too risky to put into just some normal deck. If there is a Forge of Souls deck, I think that deck might be interested in this card because they would have weapons to spare, thanks to the fact that they're going to be drawing, potentially 2 cards off of 1 card. But outside of that, I don't really see Furnace Fire Colossus finding a home. Tomb Lurker is a card that I think will see a little bit of play in the more dedicated Death Rattle decks. Unfortunately, it could also add a Death Rattle minion from your opponent, so it's not going to be as reliable as if it was only adding a Death Rattle card that had died from your deck. But I do think that between its stats and the card advantage that it could provide, that this card is good enough to see play in decks which are going to be able to really take advantage of its ability. Skulkengeist is the first straight-up tech card that we're going to see today, and for tech cards, I'm not going to give them a rating because they don't really make sense within the context of my rating system. So this guy is here to destroy Jade Druid decks. He will eat all of the Jade Idols, which really hampers their late-game strategy and is likely to just win the matchup on its own. But the cost of this is pretty high. It's a 6-drop, and its stats are okay, but it's not going to be very good unless you're playing against Jade. So if you need this card, go ahead and run it. It is very likely to win the Jade matchup, but if you don't need this card, it's going to be pretty bad, just like most tech cards. Nehrupian Unraveler is another card that I'm going to consider a tech card. You really only want this against very specific matchups. It comes down way too late in the game to have an effect against the majority of decks. So aggro decks are not really interested in playing a 6-mana 5/5 just to hamper certain strategies. I think you're only going to want this if a very spell-heavy deck, something like Miracle Rogue or Quest Mage, one of these decks is very popular and you need a way to counter them in the late game. Death Axe Punisher is a narrow card, but it does have the ability to be quite powerful. If you come down and give +2/+2 to a lifesteal minion, then you're paying 4 for 5/5 worth of stats, but it's actually even a little bit better than that, because lifesteal minions, it's kind of like they deal double damage since they're gaining life and dealing damage. So in a way, it's almost like giving +4/+4. We can just split the difference and kind of value that at giving +3/+3. So if you can play this card and have it consistently buff up a lifesteal minion, I think it's going to be quite good. But the problem is there's just not a whole lot of lifesteal minions running around. No class got more than 2 lifesteal cards, and we're going to see pretty soon that there are not a lot of neutral lifesteal minions either. So if there ever comes a time where there is a critical mass of lifesteal cards and cards that benefit from other lifesteal cards, I think this card will see play, but for the time being, I don't think it's going to make the cut, not because of its power level, but because there's just not enough lifesteal cards for this to make sense. Meatwagon is a card which has a lot of potential to be abused. The first and most obvious way to abuse this card is to put it in like a hunter deck, which can get multiple triggers off the Death Rattle, and then it will go and grab something like a Devilsaur Egg, which can then have its Death Rattle trigger be abused. The other way that you could try to use this is to buff it up beyond 4 power and have it go get something like a Malagos and cheat that out pretty early. But all things considered, you're asking a lot for this card to be good. You're going to have to play 0 power minions for this to be good in a deck which doesn't have the ability to buff it up, and you're going to have to wait to have this card and a buff up card and the ability to kill it somehow in a deck which is trying to cheat out something which is very powerful like Malagos or Ysera. So I think this card is just a little bit too cute to see widespread play. Drakari Enchanter is an exciting card, but it's a card that I think will ultimately fall flat because it requires too many other cards to be good. It can be used to double down on card draw effects such as Manatide Totem or Ysera or the Lich King, but I don't think it's good enough on its own to stand in a deck which only has a few of these cards. I think you'd have to be in a deck which is pretty dedicated to Drakari Enchanter for this to be worthwhile. It would have to be triggering multiple cards simultaneously to get value, and I think that's going to be pretty difficult to set up. So I think people are going to be excited to play this card because it has the potential to do some very busted stuff, but it's just going to be too bad in too many different scenarios, I think, for it to see play in anything but a very dedicated Drakari Enchanter deck. Our final epic card is one which I think compares to the Princes, insofar as that you probably don't want to build a deck around this in and of itself, but if there is a deck which this naturally slots into, it's going to be pretty good. So to get enough power from this card for it to be worthwhile, I think you need to hit at least 2, preferably 3 of these effects. To hit something like Divine Shield and Wind Fury is definitely good enough. Lifesteal and Wind Fury is definitely good enough. Or like Taunt, Divine Shield, and either of the other abilities, that's just great. But I don't think it's worth trying to do something cute like putting Aleco into your deck so you can just play this card, because if you draw Aleco, then this card is going to be very below rate. At that point, it would be likely to only hit Taunt, and a 4-mana 3/3 Taunt is probably not what you want to be doing in Standard. So if you're already running a deck that has like Wicker Flame Burn Bristle in it, I think Corpse Taker slots in pretty well. But if you're not running a deck that already has these effects in it, I think you want to stay away from this card. Our first rare is Phantom Freebooter, which is the only new pirate in the set. Now, adding new pirates is a bit scary because Pirate Warrior has been a strong deck for a long time, but I think fortunately for all of us on the ladder, this is not going to make a big splash in Pirate Warrior decks. This is certainly not stronger in a vacuum than Korokron Elite. I think Pirate Warrior really needs to hold on to that because it's one of its 4 damage effects that can win out of nowhere, as is Mortal Strike. Mortal Strike can definitely not be cut from the deck. So the only card this could potentially take out is Naga Corsair, but in most situations, this card is going to be quite a bit worse than Naga Corsair. It obviously has a higher ceiling, but it has a much, much lower floor. So it might warrant some testing to see if it can slot into the Pirate deck in that slot, but I don't think it's going to make an impact in the Pirate Warrior deck itself. However, I do think this card is going to be good in Paladin decks. If you play a turn 4 True Silver Champion and then play this guy on turn 5, you get a potentially a 4-mana 7/5 if you didn't attack last turn, and you could also go and grab your patches. So I think it will be very strong in mid-rangey or aggressively tilted Paladin decks. It could potentially also see play as another way to go grab patches in Rogue decks with the addition of their new weapon as well. So I do think this card is going to be able to make an impact. Having the Pirate subtype does mean it can go grab you a patches, which increases the consistency of getting that card out of your deck, but I don't think it's going to make an impact in the Pirate deck in and of itself. Our next rare is also a tribally focused card, this time for dragons, but I think this card is going to have a much, much bigger impact on the metagame than Phantom Freebooter will. So the reason why this card is good is because a 6-mana 6/5 is already not bad, but drawing a random dragon is pretty nice. Dragons tend to have very powerful effects like Alexstrasza or Deathwing, and though there are a few whiffs, like a Midnight Drake is generally not the best, and there are a few dragon-specific cards which might not be good to draw if you're just running this in a standard mid-range deck, but I do think that the power level of this card is going to be enough for mid-range decks to be interested in this if they need something to do on turn 6, which is likely to create a 2-for-1, and this is certainly going to slot into existing dragon decks such as Dragon Priest, potentially over Bookworm. I just think that this effect is easier to curve into and is a little more consistent than Bookworm. So I would definitely expect to see a good portion of this card in dragon-related decks, and in the occasional mid-range deck, which needs something nice to do on turn 6. Ticking Abomination has become a bit of a meme because it was the very first card that was revealed from the new set, and I think people were expecting something a little better for the first card to come out. So I think this card tends to catch some flack for being a meme, and people might not be realizing that there actually will be a home for this in certain strategies. So if you're the style of deck that doesn't really try to get on the board very much until turn 4 or turn 5, I think that you might be interested in this card because a 4 mana 5/6 is just very big. Anything like an aggressive deck just cannot afford to run this because killing this, of course, will kill all of your own minions, or at least it's very likely it will. So it's a little too risky to run in a normal strategy, but I think there will be some control decks or some strange kind of combo decks which just need a way to get on the board and interfere with their opponent on turn 4, and they might be interested in having this card. I don't think it's worth trying to put this card into something like a silence deck to try to get around the death rattle effect, but I do think that it will see a little more play than people are expecting. Corpse Raiser is a card which does have a pretty powerful effect, but it seems to be one of many, many cards in this set which are only good when you're already winning or have already played a powerful minion. If I've already put a powerful minion on the board, I'm not really interested in playing something that's below rate and kind of expensive to make it even more powerful. I'm a little more concerned in being able to close out the game or make sure that my opponent isn't able to do something really strong. I think that people will immediately go to a card like Tyrion Fordring when they think about this, but I really don't think you want to put this in your deck just to make Tyrion Fordring better. He really doesn't need any help to be good. So I'm going to give a pass to Corpse Raiser. Serenite Chain Gang is a card with a lot of play to it. You can do just a ton of different things with this. The first thing that comes to my mind is Evolve decks. If you play this, you get 2 4-mana cards, which are kind of doppelgangster-esque if you want to evolve those. It curves very well into the new Death Knight card for Shaman. This card also works really well with hand buff effects. If you can buff this up while it's in your hand, it will come down and make 2 copies of a buffed up card. So I think between these 2 decks, this card will be able to find a home. It doesn't really demand very much of your deck building to be strong. It just kind of slots into decks which are already good, and it's not even embarrassing to play on its own without any synergy. So I would expect to see quite a bit of Serenite Chain Gang in the upcoming set. Happy Ghoul is yet another rare that I think we're going to have to keep our eye out for in Knights of the Frozen Throne. Mana reduction effects are typically very powerful, so I can see this card being used in a couple of ways, particularly in aggressive strategies to get on the board early with a relatively big minion in the first 3 turns. So the first thing that you can try to do with this is play a card like Flame Imp, which damages yourself, and then play any healing effect that's stapled to another card. The other thing I could see this doing is being played as a way to curve out with the Shadow Ascendant and Priest decks. That would really let you get on the board early and in a pretty big way. So between all the different ways that you're able to heal your hero, I think this card is going to find some play. I don't think that standard priest decks are going to want this unless they really have a way to take advantage of it, because a 3-mana 3/3 body does not scale well into the late game. I think this is definitely a tempo card for decks that are aggressive and really want to put the hurt on their opponent in the early game. Shallow Gravedigger is a pretty good value card, which will certainly see some play in dedicated Death Rattle decks. And I also think this card is good enough to see play in like a mid-range Rogue deck, because Rogue just has such a high concentration of powerful Death Rattle cards that they would be very happy to draw off of this, that I think this is very frequently going to be a high-value play, especially in combination with the new Plague Scientist. So when you put that all together, I think what we have is a fairly solid card that's not going to break the metagame or anything, but is certainly going to see some play. Mindbreaker is a tech card, plain and simple. It's a card that I'm really glad exists, because if any of the new Death Knight hero powers get really out of hand, you're going to need a counter for that, and that's what Mindbreaker can offer. As a 3-mana 2/5, it's less embarrassing than some of the other tech cards because the body is pretty big, so I think you're going to be happy to play this in many mid-range or even control decks that have problems with Death Knights in the late game, but you have to have a reason to play this. Keening Banshee is a card which I think is just not quite big enough to fit into aggro strategies on its size alone, and doesn't really offer any synergy to go along with. So I don't expect to see a lot of this card around, but a 4-mana 5/5 is a pretty big body, so it might be able to squeak its way into some very aggressive decks which just need something big to do on turn 4. Our first common is a card that has a lot of potential. If this Death Rattle effect were to always work, if it did not have the your opponent's turn clause, then this would be an extremely powerful card. As it stands, though, I think you're going to have to find a way to make your opponent attack into this, because in most cases, they're just going to be able to ignore a 2/2 for a pretty long time. So what you can potentially do is give this taunt. You could go 5 into 6 with a card like Spike Ridge Steed, and then your opponent is forced to deal with this. So if you're in a deck which can facilitate the taunt strategy, maybe something like Silence Priest, which is already playing cards like Defender of Argus, or Sun Fury Protector, then I think you might be interested in this card. But if you're not playing effects which can give this taunt, or are otherwise forcing your opponent to trade into this, then I think this one is not going to be good enough. Snow Flipper Penguin has some awesome art, but it's a 0-mana 1/1, which is to say that it's very, very bad. The only thing that this really has going for it is that it's a beast. So if there are any beast synergies, perhaps in like a very beast-oriented deck, or with the Curator in some kind of combo deck that would need a 0-mana beast for some reason, I could see this seeing a little bit of play, but this should not be going into the majority of decks. Grim Necromancer is a card that just seems great. 4 mana for 4/6 worth of stats is excellent. Spread across 3 bodies is just really good. I think decks which are going to be able to take advantage of the extra bodies, such as Aggro Token Druid with Mark of the Lotus and Power of the Wild and Savage Roar, as well as potentially some Evolved Shaman decks that have Bloodlust, they're definitely going to be in the market for a card like this. If there are any kind of replaceable 4-drops in those decks, I think this will immediately slot in. Sunborn Valkyr is, I think, a card without a home. Aggro strategies aren't going to really want to buff up their health very much by curving into this on turn 5, and control decks probably aren't going to have enough board presence to want to play this. So that would leave mid-range decks, and I think mid-range decks are just going to have more efficient options than this card. So Sunborn Valkyr gets a pass from me. Next up is our other neutral dragon card, and one that I think is pretty interesting. I don't think that Dragon Priests are going to want to play this over Draconid Operative, but if you're in a non-priest deck, I think you're going to be pretty interested in this effect. 8/5 worth of stats on the first turn, even if it does come at a small delay, is pretty big, and if you don't kill this soon, things might get out of hand. So I think in non-Dragon Priest decks, this will be able to find a home. And it might even be able to see some play in aggressively tilted mid-range decks as well. Night Howler is a card which I think requires a little bit too much setup to see any play. 4 mana 3/4 is a little bit under the bar, and for this to be really threatening, it needs to take damage at least twice, which I think is asking a lot. Venomancer is a fascinating card because a high toughness poisonous minion threatens to trade 2 for 1 with a fair amount of ease. If you can hit one minion and kill it and survive to do the same thing again, I think you're going to be very happy with what you got out of this card. The question is, can you afford to take turn 5 off to play this and then wait an additional turn or 2 to be able to collect your value from it? So I think there might be some more controlling decks which are naturally light on removal, perhaps Druid, which might be interesting in this effect, and I also think that priest decks which are capable of buffing up its toughness with something like a Cabal Talon Priest might be interested in this card as well. Vrygul is a card which I think is going to miss the mark, not because it's too bad, but just because it does not compare favorably to Egg Napper, which is a more consistent card that creates 2 bodies instead of 1, which is generally preferable for aggro decks. This next card I do think will be able to see some play in aggro decks. Acheris, or Acheris Veteran, I'm not sure how to say this one. It compares favorably to an existing card, which is Abusive Sergeant. And Abusive Sergeant was able to see some play in some styles of Zoo decks as a 1-mana 1/1, but this card's a 1-mana 2/1, so it's a better body on its own. And I think it's arguable that giving a minion +1 attack permanently is at least as good or better than giving one +2 attack on the turn that you play this. So I would expect this in certain kinds of Warlock Zoo, and this could even go into an aggro deck for a class which is light on class cards that are good at aggro, such as Priest. And for 1 additional mana, you can also give a minion 1 point of toughness, which doesn't seem very good when you stack the 2 cards up against each other. I wouldn't expect Fallen Sun Cleric, which is a throwback to Shattered Sun Cleric, to see much play. This brings us to our final card in the series of minions which come down and buff up minions you have in play, and also to the biggest and best of them all. Bone Mare gives you a ton of stats for 7 mana, and the best part about all this is that 4/4 of the 9/9 worth of stats that you're getting, you can use immediately. It's like you're getting 4/4 charge almost. So I think Bone Mare is incredibly efficient, and this is going to be a tool in many mid-range and certain control decks to go over the top. This brings us to our 2 vanilla lifesteal cards. Both of them have very relevant types. One of them is a beast and one of them is a murloc, but I only think that Bloodworm is going to be the playable one of the two. Murloc decks just have better things to be doing on turn 1, such as buffing up their other murlocs or playing a threat which cannot be pinged to death by a hero power, whereas Bloodworm threatens to really get out of hand if you're playing cards such as the one we just talked about, Bone Mare, which are capable of giving this taunt or making this quite large. So I would expect Bloodworm to see some play in mid-range decks, especially in ones which are running effects that buff up their minions, like Blessing of Kings, but I would not expect Deadscale Knight to make much of an impact. Necrotic Geist is a card which looks to be a finisher in go wide or token style strategies. It has a similar effect to a card like Soul of the Forest in that it makes 2/2s when your minions die, but it's certainly not an insurance policy in the way that Soul of the Forest is, because as a 6 mana 5/3, this thing is quite fragile, and your opponent should be able to easily trade away for this or kill it with an efficient removal spell. So the way I see this card being used is to be plopped down in decks which have already gone wide, and then used that turn to immediately trade all of their minions into the board to generate a board's worth of 2/2s. That's a fairly narrow situation, so I don't imagine this card seeing a lot of play. Now let's take a look at all of our spell damage minions from the neutral commons. Our first of which is Spellweaver. As a 6 mana 4/4, the body is pretty unimpressive, and I think it's just going to come down too late in the game to have that big of an impact. If you play this on turn 6, it's fairly likely to die before you actually get to cast any spells, and if you play this late, you're only going to have a little bit of mana left over to do anything with it. So this one is a pass. Tainted Zealot as a 2 mana minion that is 1/1 and has spell damage +1 will immediately draw some comparisons to Blood Mage Thalnos. I don't think this card is anywhere close to as good as Blood Mage Thalnos is, but it is a little bit more sticky, and it's considerably stickier than Kobold Geomancer or Cult Sorcerer, which are the only other 2 options at 2 mana to give you spell damage +1. So I think if you're in a class like Mage or Rogue, which has fairly limited options for dealing with boards of minions that are wide and mid-size, if you really, really need another Blood Mage Thalnos effect, you might be interested in this card. I don't think it's quite strong enough to be instantly played in a wide variety of decks like Blood Mage Thalnos is, but in decks that do need to double down on that effect, I think this is your best option. Our final spell damage minion is Tuskar Fisherman, who I do not think compares very favorably to our previous card, Tainted Zealot. The issue with Tuskar Fisherman is that he doesn't actually do what you want him to do when you have an empty board, and I think a key aspect of these spell damage minions is that they have to be able to be drawn off the top of the deck and played on an empty board when you're behind to collect their effect. You want to be able to double up on the damage that you get from Fan of Knives or get that extra bit of damage that you need from a Volcanic Potion, and Tuskar Fisherman is just not going to be able to give that to you. Wretched Tiller is a card that might seem good on first glance for aggro decks because it is basically attacking for 3 as a 1-cost minion, which is pretty good. However, it's going to die to Mage, Druid, and Rogue hero powers as it only has 1 toughness before it will have any effect on the game. Since this doesn't have a battle cry or an end of turn effect, I'm not very optimistic about this card's ability to be consistent enough to find a spot in aggro decks. Hildner Frostrider is a 3 mana 4/4, so right there it should draw some attention from you, but of course it does have a drawback. Are there any situations where this drawback can actually be a positive? Well, yes. In the Shaman Freeze deck, you can play this alongside Murabi as a way to double up on all of the minions that you have. Outside of that, it could potentially see play in decks which are very low on 1 and 2 drops, but I think if you're trying to play any minions on turns 1 or 2, you're just not going to be interested in freezing them for a turn. This brings us to our only neutral elemental of the set, which is Grave Shambler. But unfortunately for you elemental fans out there, I don't think this one is going to make the cut in standard decks. 4 mana 4/4 isn't terrible, but the ability on it is going to be virtually textless in way too many games for this to be worth a slot in your deck. Next up is Wicked Skeleton, which I think is a pretty classic case of a win more card. This card's just really, really bad if you have an empty board. A 4 mana 1/1 is very embarrassing, and it's really only good if you already have a sizable board and are capable of trading off a bunch of minions. And even then, you would need to trade off 4 more minions for this to be a passable card. So I think this one is just not going to make the cut in any decks. This brings us to the very last card of the set, Death Speaker. And this is a pretty cool one. It gives immune to one of your minions, which is a very rare effect, and the stats on it aren't very bad as a 3 mana 2/4. So I think there are going to be just enough cases where you're willing to put this into your deck that this card will see some play. It's pretty good to give immune to a poison minion or to a minion that has a high amount of power and low amount of health remaining. So I think you'll know if you want this card, and you'll also probably know if you don't want it. And that wraps up our set review for Knights of the Frozen Throne. Overall, I'm pretty pleased with some of the new designs that we're seeing in this set. We're getting a lot of new and pretty flavorful abilities. I think a lot of these cards look fun as well as competitive, and I'm optimistic that this set will be able to shake up the metagame and keep things interesting for the next few months until the set after it comes out. So I hope you guys enjoyed this set review. Please let me know what you guys thought of it in the comments, which cards you disagreed with, which cards you agreed with, if you guys liked the system that I used for grading the cards, and I can take all of that data and use it so that next time I do a set review, I can make it even better. So I appreciate your feedback, and thanks for watching.